Hey, this is Mr. Drogemeyer. Thanks for joining me for our Algebra 1 lesson videos. We are now in Unit 4, and today we're going to look at Lessons 2 and 3, which deal with identifying functions. And so we're going to start with some vocabulary terms that will be important for us to know when we're talking about functions. So the first two terms are relation and function. And so a relation is basically a relationship between sets of values or sets of numbers. So um, height and age in people has a relationship. Um, when we talk about functions, a function is a specific type of relation. And for it to be a function, every input value that we have in that function has exactly one output value. So we have that bolded in italics there. That's the key for determining if a relation is a function. Uh, every input that we have has just exactly one output value that's tied to it. And we're going to look at some examples here. Um, we'll also talk about the vertical line test. I'm just going to introduce that a little bit today. We'll look at it again later on in the unit, but vertical line test is it's a visual way that we can determine if a relation is a function. So we'll look at a graph of the relation, and if we bring a vertical line across that graph, if that vertical line ever intersects or crosses the graph at more than one point at a time, then that tells us that it's not a function. And we'll look at some examples of that as well. All right, and then the last two hopefully aren't new terms to you, but maybe just a quick refresher. We have domain and range. And so when we're talking about a function, the domain is going to be the complete set of possible input values. So domain, that's our inputs. Um, Generally, kind of our general rule of thumb, we use X to represent our inputs or our domain. Range is going to be the output values. Generally, you're going to see Y used for range values. Those can be different, but that's kind of our general rules of thumb. All right, and so I have a couple of diagrams here of relations, and we want to look at these and determine if the relation is a function or not a function. And so you can see here in this first example, we have our domain values listed here, and then the arrows pointing to the corresponding range value for that domain. So these are our inputs. When I input -1, I get an output of -1. When I input 0, I get an output of 0, and so on. And so to determine if it's a function, we want to look, does each input value have exactly one output value? Well, we can see here, each one of these is pointing to exactly one output value. Now, you'll notice -1 and 2, they both point to the same output value of -1, but this is still going to be a function because remember that definition says each input exactly one output. So we don't have any inputs that are pointing to two or more output values. Everyone is tied to exactly one output value. So this is an example of a function. Excuse me. In our second example here, again, we have our domain listed, our inputs. -1 has an output or a range value of -1. It also has a value of 0. 0 with 0, 1 with 1, 2 with 1. This one we would say is not a function. And the reason here, we have an input, -1, that is associated with two different output values. So if we ever have a domain value or an input value that is pointing to more than one output value, that's not a function. One other thing I want to show you here real quick before I jump to some graphs. These domain and range values, you may also see them listed as ordered pairs. So thinking of an ordered pair looks something like this. Be familiar with that when you're plotting points on a graph. Our input value, our x value goes first, our y value goes second. And so for this one here, we'd have -1 is our x value, -1 is our y value. When x is 0, y is 0. When x is 1, y is 1. And then finally, when x is 2, our y value, our range value is -1. And we could do the same thing here. We have -1 and -1. We also have -1 and 0. We have 0 and 0. We have 1 and 1. And then we have 2 and 1. And so even if we just had these ordered pairs, we could see that this one is not a function because we have those two domain values that are associated with, or that's the same domain value associated with two different range values. So input can only be have exactly one output value for it to be a function. All right, so the last thing I wanted to look at was looking at these on a graph. And so I've plotted these same relations that we were looking at here using the Desmos calculator. And you are allowed to use this Desmos calculator. You can find it it should be in the backpack in your lessons. You can also just go online to desmos.com and choose the calculator. But so I plotted those points that we had in that first relation. And so you can see them here. Here's -1, 1, or excuse me, -1, -1. Here's 0, 0. Here's 1, 1. And here's the point -2, 1. And so I've also have this vertical line. And so what the vertical line test does is if I cross this past those values, notice that it never touches more than one of those plotted points at a time. So there, it's hitting one there, one there, one there, one there. If we can bring that vertical line across and it's not touching more than one point at a time, that means that that relation is a function. And that's what we said, that first one is a function. Our second one we said is not a function. So I've plotted those points for that one here. So here's our -1, -1, -1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 1. And then again, I have our vertical line. Well, notice what happens here when I get to this spot right there. Right at that point, I'm crossing 2 points at the same time. So that's our vertical line test. If I'm ever crossing more than one point that we've plotted, or that's a part of our relation, that tells me that it's not a function. So this is not a function because it doesn't pass that vertical line test. And then, like we said in our what we were looking at with our other things here, we looked at that several different ways, but each of those ways shows us whether it's a function or not a function. All right, and that's all I've got for you guys today. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. If you have questions, please let me know. Thanks. Have a great day.